Hello, everyone. Professor Krizluk here. So, when we talk about contentious politics, again, the collective actions that ordinary people use to challenge political authority. Few documents are as powerful or paint as vivid of a picture of struggle as Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from Birmingham Jail, which was written in 1963. So this letter is more than just a historical artifact. It's read on the House floor in Congress. It is oftentimes read at universities. I think I've had 4 or 5 courses where this was an assigned reading. So this is an influential and inspirational piece of writing when it comes to contentious politics and civil society. So this letter is a strategic as well as a moral manifesto about why people protest. When protest is justified, when contentious politics is justified, and how it interacts with democratic institutions. So King wrote the letter while confined in the Birmingham, Alabama jail cell. He had been arrested for participating in nonviolent demonstrations against racial segregation. Local white clergy had published a public statement calling the protests unwise and untimely. They urged patience and legal channels, expressing concerns that demonstrations might disrupt social order. King's response is not defensive or is not a defensive apology. Instead, it's a direct, deeply reasoned argument about why protests, even at times when it means breaking laws, is sometimes necessary in a democracy. So, to understand King's argument, we need to remember a few key points about how protests function in democratic politics. In your other videos, we've talked about how contentious politics becomes an avenue of influence when formal institutions, when formal channels of power, such as legislatures, courts, and elections, seem closed or slow to respond. Letter from Birmingham Jail is a clear, articulate example of that dynamic, which King lays out of why it's important. King begins by rejecting the notion that time alone solves injustices. Wait is often the most common response from those in power when they are challenged. But for those who have or who are living under repression, wait often becomes a strategy of inaction. King writes that justice too long delayed is justice denied. For people well served by the status quo, patience costs little. For those who are marginalized, waiting can mean a lifetime of inequality. So King frames nonviolent protests as a method of creating constructive tension. He describes nonviolent direct action not as aimless disruptions, but as part of a 4-step process of collecting facts, negotiating, self-purification, and direct action. The purpose of direct action is to create a crisis, not to tear down society, but to expose injustices that the status quo has ignored. The crisis, that tension is meant to force open a conversation that would otherwise be deferred or denied. This gets at a core feature of contentious politics in democracies. Formal political channels, voting, lobbying, litigation, have roles, have gates, and timelines. They often require resources, organizational connections, and access to power brokers. When these routes appear blocked or slow, protest becomes a way to signal urgency, amplify voices, and claim political legitimacy outside of those institutional channels. But King does not dismiss legality altogether. He draws a crucial distinction between just laws and unjust laws. He argues that an unjust law is one that degrades human personality and is out of harmony with moral laws. In his view, people have a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. This is not mere defiance, it is a principled resistance grounded in a belief in universal justice. This distinction between legality and legitimacy is at the heart of why Letter from Birmingham Jail remains relevant to today and finds its way into university classrooms. A law may be legal, passed by a legislature and enforced by courts, but still lacks legitimacy if it systematically harms a group of people. King's letter is about the limits of legality when it becomes indistinguishable from injustice. King's emphasis on nonviolence is strategic as much as moral. Nonviolence, he argues, forces opponents and bystanders to confront the violence of injustice without turning protest into reciprocal physical violence. When police dogs and fire hoses are used against peaceful marchers, the moral contrast becomes stark and visible, drawing public sympathy and political pressure onto the system, onto the structure. In contentious politics, framing thus very much matters. How a movement is seen often determines how political actors respond. King also anticipates a common criticism of protest, that it is outside the democratic process. He responds by pointing that the democratic process is not a single channel but a suite of channels, including public opinion, moral appeal, and direct experience. When the legal system enforces segregation, it is not protest that subverts democracy. It is the absence of justice that subverts democracy. Excuse me. This argument helps us see protests in a different light. Protest is not simply or not merely or not even a breakdown of democratic norms, but often a response to those breakdowns, to their breakdowns. When institutions fail to protect rights or ensure equality, people push back through collective action. And they do so not in spite of democratic legitimacy, but because they believe that democracy's promises are not being fulfilled. So the letter from Birmingham Jail also highlights the way that protest links local conditions to national attention. Birmingham may have been a city with its own particular laws and social practices, but by protesting there and by explaining his reasoning in a letter circulated widely, King transformed a local injustice into a national moral issue. That ability to scale a grievance, to make visible beyond its immediate context, is the defining strength of successful protest movements. So, in the context of your previous videos and your readings and what we've been talking about on contentious politics, King's letter helps explain why movements strategically choose where and when to act, how protests can reframe public debate, and how moral reasoning complements political strategy. It also underscores that protest carries risks, something we talked about in class. And at times it includes imprisonment, social backlash, and political misrepresentation. King embraced these risks because he believed they were necessary to expose the structural injustice of segregation. Finally, King's letter is a reminder that protest is not just about expressing dissatisfaction. It is about claim making, asserting that a political community has not lived up to its own principles, and that demanding that it do better. In the American context, that often means appealing to constitutional ideas of equality and liberty, even when those ideals have been denied in practice. So, for students thinking about contentious politics, or if you're just starting your journey on contentious politics, Letter from Birmingham Jail is a master class in the moral and strategic logic of protest. It shows that protest is not an eruption of emotion, nor just a simple rejection of democracy. It is oftentimes a deep engagement with democratic values pushed to their limits, demanding that political institutions live up to their own promises. Thank you.